Reading about climate change can feel immobilizing. But what if making a difference was as simple as just planting a few shrubs or flowers in your neighborhood? Environmental researchers say gardens full of native plants can save species of pollinators and other necessary wildlife. They can also help us preserve resources like water and green space. So today on CityCast Portland, we're talking with my good friend Peter Condra. He's an Oregon master naturalist and works for the Columbia Land Trust, which is home to the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. He's here to point us all in the right direction to start better using our garden spaces and broaden our knowledge of what planting natively actually means. It's Tuesday, October 17th. I'm Claudia Meza, and this is what Portland's talking about. Peter, thanks so much for hanging out with me today.
Happy to be here. The musician to gardener pipeline is real, and I am so happy we're on it together.
Full disclosure, Peter's a friend, and he's actually helped me greatly with my own gardening. But could you just remind me again, why is it important to have native plants?
So in terms of land use, in the US, we've got 40 million acres of lawn, which is just under the size of Washington State. We have 43 million acres of pavement, which is just over the size of Washington State. This is all, kind of like low-hanging fruit in this conflict we have of biodiversity loss. There's just tremendous amount of declines in birds and pollinators and all kinds of wildlife globally. So it's kind of just like, there's so many things with climate change and environmental issues that just feel out of your control. And a lot of this is, but with this opportunity where you're like literally sitting on lawns and pavements at your home in your neighborhoods, like you can actually convert that to usable habitat for wildlife that really helps kind of connect the preserved areas that we have, because it's not just habitat loss, it's fragmentation. We need to kind of weave through a corridor for wildlife. And so it's actually one of the only fun things I've found in like environmentally friendly behaviors. Everything else is like, eat less bacon, eat less beef, like don't drive, don't travel. It's like, such a bummer. But this is like actually fun. You're like, hey, all these critters just showed up because I planted this stuff. And it's just like, it's been a lot of fun to get into it.
Yeah. So basically you're saying like biodiversity is essentially just more than like lawn or more than like your ornamental shrubbery that looks really cute, but like that isn't feeding anything. And I never thought about this. Actually, Peter, this is something that's never connected, is when people think about like, oh, these species, they're just like, oh, we have a preserve. Like that's where they live. But it's like, how are they supposed to get there?
Right, exactly.
Well, what are some common misconceptions that people have about native plants in Portland?
Well, I think that people think of like plant communities in Western Oregon. They think of maybe like Forest Park or like a closed canopy Doug firs. It's our state tree, and it's really actually overrepresented on the landscape historically. Before colonization, before the state of Oregon existed, indigenous land management would have kept the valley floor clear of a lot of shrubs and conifers. It would have been a much more open grassland dotted with oaks. So really that plant community of oaks, grasslands, and wildflowers was historically much more part of what you would see here. So kind of picture like what something you might see driving around in some parts of California.
Something that you told me, I remember that I was like, whoa, because when we go out into nature in Oregon, especially in our area, it's a bunch of Doug firs. But when you were like, no, that's the product of like over harvesting, like, just from the timber industry, and people being like, oh, we got to plant more. And how they would just drop seeds from planes or just, like it was just a ton. And that's how you would know, like, this isn't natural, guys. Like, this is just a thing that we made.
Right. Yeah. Doug fir's, been tremendously useful for timber production. So it's been favored on the landscape in that way. So you'll see that, if you drive along the 26 and you see like a really dense forest, it's like, that's not a forest, that's a plantation. So
so sad. I'm sorry. Just to think that we're just driving. We're like, it's so beautiful. And you're like, it's a plantation.
I mean, yeah. And like, I'm not totally hating on forestry. We all, like, need those products and services. But that represents a major change to the landscape, and in areas that are not as intensively managed for timber, just fire suppression alone has really changed the plant communities, because fire tends to knock back Doug firs, whereas it favors oaks. Oaks are more fire tolerant. So
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a reason why we have in our area, the Northwest, we have such blazing fires during fire season because of the way that these trees were planted and the fact that there wasn't enough of a corridor for things to die out.
yeah, definitely thinning is a thing. Thinning through fire and mechanical thinning is a way that some natural area managers and foresters are trying to deal with fire, for sure.
Yeah. So let's talk about climate change, because at one point, you know, like you said, before colonization, before the timber industry, the forest, our environment here in Oregon looked very, very different. You brought up the oak tree, which I think is really interesting, because you basically, I remember you were very adamant that I plant an oak somewhere in my plot,
Yes.
because you were just like, do you understand? This is a prehistoric, you know, tree. Could you explain why like an oak tree is like, you know, so valuable to environmental sustainability?
Yeah, oaks, wherever they tend to occur, are what's called a keystone species. So they support a disproportionate amount of wildlife and other plant communities. So they just one thought on why this may be is that it's just a really old genus of trees. So there's been a long time for insects and birds to co-evolve with it, to learn how to feed from it. Its main chemical defenses are just tannins, which are not like that hard to override or get past. So it basically is. It feeds a ton of insects, which feeds a tons of birds, and on and on. And so they're long lived. Also, they store a lot of carbon. They're beautiful. They have tremendous value to indigenous cultures in Oregon and wherever they occur. And I would just say that if you can plant one, you know, don't be afraid of it becoming this giant thing that overtakes your lawn. Like, that's going to take decades. You'd be lucky if it, you know, really established and reached that. That's what we want.
Yeah. All right, well, let's take a quick break here, and when we return, more on gardening with native plants.
Are you tired of seeing Portland city government be so weak sauce? Progress Portland is a team of locals who've come together to advocate for a more diverse, progressive city council in 2024. On our podcast, we interview exciting candidates like Angelita Murillo, running in District 3.
When I talk to people about public safety and public health, I try to explain to them that housing is public health and public safety. Adequate services for addiction, all of that is public safety.
And Steph Routh, running in District 1.
How do we knit together better policies that lift all boats, that we achieve shared prosperity?
District representation and an expanded council will mean a greater voice for the people of Portland. We want a city council that will fight for fair pay and strong unions, housing the homeless, and true police reform. Subscribe to the Progress Portland podcast now, wherever you listen to podcasts, and join our grassroots movement at progressportland.org.
So what are some other good native plants to start your garden? Like if you want to, you know, achieve a natural habitat certification or just, you know, help out.
Totally. Yeah, I will reference some of the ones that have just been kind of like the toughest and the requiring the least water, because that's, I think, a great consideration across the board. So in terms of trees, I always say, you know, go big if you have the room. That would be, of course, the oak, but also the Willamette Valley ponderosa pine. You'll see that you can kind of tell what's working as you drive around freeways and see what they've been planting. You'll see those two growing together. Madrones are pretty fickle, but they're awesome, and you're not supposed to water them, so that's cool if they survive. One that's kind of adjacent to Portland, but certainly native, is the incense cedar as opposed to the western red cedar. Western red cedars are the ones you'll see often like dead along the side of the roads. They're not taking heat. So incense cedar is a really good drought heat tolerant alternative. In terms of like more wildflowers, things in the aster family are really great. So that's going to be stuff like goldenrod, pearly everlasting, Douglas aster, and coyote bush, they all kind of take care of themselves all summer and then start blooming July all the way through October. So if you have a bunch of those, they grow really vigorously. It might look kind of wild, but if they're all paired together, then they balance each other out. You get a really great late season bloom. In terms of shrubs, our state flower, the tall Oregon grape, not loved by everyone, but definitely planted a lot.
Because it looks kind of like a weed almost.
It's a little gnarly looking. I think you got it, like, it's really everywhere in like parking lots throughout like banks and shopping centers. They got Oregon grape there, and somehow it's surviving really well. So I think mixing that in with other tough ones like buckbrush is a local form of ceanothus that I have never watered at my house, doing great. Blue elderberry, ocean spray. Those are some of my favorite ones that are surviving the recent hot summers we're having.
I love that when we talk about native plants now, we're actually thinking about what can grow natively here and withstand climate change. So I remember you telling me to plant a lot of things that had the word California in it. And I was like, well, how is this a native plant? It's from California. And you're just like, because it's going to be native here very soon. And I was like, no.
Yeah, I guess, the truth on that is we'll see. We're all kind of speculating what migration of plant species will look like. Certainly a lot of foresters are experimenting with tree varieties, maybe of the same species, but maybe from a lower latitude, or bringing stuff up from the Southwest. A lot of evergreen oaks from California and the Southwest are really great street trees. A lot of California chaparral plants are perfect for small spaces. They just kind of naturally top out as like 8 to 10 foot size like bushes, and they're evergreen, they're flowering, drought tolerant. Wildlife do use them, so they check a lot of boxes without being like in that really nerdy, strictly local, this is Portland native. At some point, those distinctions, when you stare a little too hard at it, like about native versus not, are like whatever. You want to kind of think about the full perspective of your land use. There's other things to, nature friendly landscaping. It's are you using stormwater smartly? Are you providing habitat for pollinators? Are you not using pesticides? There's all these other ways that are beyond just like, is this plant native or not?
Yeah, I remember you bringing that up, especially when discussing microclimates and how like you're just like, yeah, something that grows 20 miles away may not grow that great here. And that was just like, what's happening? Like how do you figure that out? Like, what are your tips?
Yeah, definitely folks in nursery will definitely be able to help you with that. And to your point, like a sidewalk strip in Lents, a hot southeast neighborhood with reflective pavement everywhere, that is not representative of any native conditions, climate-wise, that local plants would have experienced. That's going to be tough on pretty much anything. So that's just is what it is. In terms of microclimates, some plants you might have read, oh, this is like a full sun plant. Well, maybe it's going to survive a little bit better with some afternoon shade. Can really go a long way in terms of helping things survive that. You can kind of create microclimates by varying the topography with some berms and some ditches, adding elements of shade in strategic areas, maybe with a fence or just with another shrub to kind of shade a younger one. So I think kind of looking for that, and a lot of trial and error is just the truth about how this works. There's no guarantees. Just, I think if you're going to do this process, just remember to have fun with it. It is a creative opportunity. Like I said, it's one of the only fun things I've encountered in terms of fighting climate change, preventing biodiversity loss. So just experiment with it, make it your own. And if you can, feature native plants, at least in a portion of your yard, that's a great contribution, and then experiment with those other, fun ones.
But if you were just like, okay, I want to start with 3 plants, what are 3 plants that you could just like, these 3 work well together and they'll get you on your way?
Right. The way I'd like to answer that is just in terms of spreading out blooms throughout the season, because a good strategy is to have a long bloom season, staggered blooms. So I guess in order, of kind of larger shrubs, the red flowering currant is going to bloom really early, make you real happy on a gray April day when you see hummingbirds coming out for it. So that's a really good one. For more midsummer, blue elderberry, if you have room, gets real big. I say, go big or go home. And then that's going to bloom in midsummer. And for really late blooms, coyote bush is blooming like September through October. So you kind of are bookending your year with the earliest and the latest. And that's a great thing to do, to just kind of not be like, oh, my one flower bloomed, I'm sad, now it's winter. You can kind of draw it out into a longer season.
So if Portlanders wanted to really get serious about if they have the space, and I remember you saying like you don't need that much space, like even if it's like a square foot, if that's all you have to give, it's going to be just fine. But like, how can Portlanders, if they want, how can they access the Backyard Habitat Certification Program if that was important to them?
Right. Yeah. So the Backyard Habitat Certification Program is co-managed by Columbia Land Trust and Portland Audubon. You can, find it through either of our channels, or you can go to backyardhabitats.org. And that is one way that you can get a really neat service to help get like an individualized consultation on your site. For a sliding scale, someone will come out and tell you like, here's what I see working here, here are your challenges. And it's really, in terms of this show being about what's special about Portland, that is such a thing in terms of how much that program caught on like wildfire, and is just like, there's a waiting list. It's expanded to multiple counties throughout the area. So I would say hit them up and they'll give you some good pointers. You also get coupons for different nurseries that can help you get started. And, the gist of the program is a variety of nature-friendly principles beyond just planting native plants. They have a certification system, which is really just to help you kind of set goals. The lowest rung is very attainable. It's just like a small portion of your yard dedicated to habitat. And then if you're really hardcore, you can go for the top certification, do everything native, but they'll make you work for it. So, that's for really hardcore participants.
Well, how much land does someone need to be able to share? Like, is there a minimum, I guess is what I'm asking?
I'm not aware of there being a minimum at all. I think that they tend to work up to 1 acre in size is more what the cap is. But also just the website has tons of materials. There's a lot of great resources out there. You can just kind of do your own research and start to experiment with it. But it's pretty neat to have someone come out and kind of talk about it with you. So it's part of a growing movement. It's really set a precedent, I'd say, in terms of how planting native plants in a neighborhood can really help bring wildlife back around.
Cool. Well, thank you, Peter. I really appreciate you taking the time and hanging out with me. It's so crazy, Peter, like you just sort of you just did this. Like 10 years ago, you and I were playing shows, and now you're just like, this plant expert. It's just amazing.
One day you're young and wild, the next you're like, honey, did you see that Western tanager or something? I'm clearly not there yet.
Birding and planting, two different things.
Yeah, birding is next stop for sure.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you for having me, and I'll see you at Slim's.
Yeah.
And now for your microdose of news. TriMet is rolling out a new generation of MAX trains for the first time in a decade. The 6th generation trains have room for 160 riders and improve heating and cooling. The first generation of trains are now retiring after traveling some 2 million miles. Here's hoping they get turned into quirky food and drink spots. I don't know. I would totally go to a pod made up of retired TriMet food carts. What's more Portland than that? And Oregon is now spending Medicaid dollars to house people, specifically those whose medical conditions would worsen without a place to live. It's not clear yet whether this approach will be cost-effective in the long run, but advocates are placing their bets that paying for housing up front will be more sustainable than paying the medical bills for our most vulnerable as they try surviving out on the streets. For even more local news and events, sign up for our daily newsletter, Hey Portland. We'll throw a link in the show notes. That's all for today here on CityCast Portland. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend, rate or leave us a good review. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more from around the city. Until then, see you at Slim's.